My nephew stood up in a lawyer's conference room, pointed his finger at me, and told the whole family I was an old fool still living in the past. Nobody defended me. Not my sister. Not one cousin. They laughed. Actual laughter, in a room where my mother's ashes hadn't even been in the ground 3 weeks. I sat there in a folding chair with my hands folded on the table, and I said nothing. Not because I didn't have anything to say, because I already knew something none of them did. And in about 11 minutes, the lawyer was going to say it for me. My name is Walter Renner. I'm 67 years old. I spent 34 years as a structural engineer, mostly bridge and retaining wall work for the North Carolina Department of Transportation, and I live in a house I built with my own hands off Kimberly Avenue in Asheville. I used to believe that if you did right by people long enough, quietly, without keeping score, it would eventually be seen. I was wrong about that. It doesn't get seen. Not on its own. Sometimes you have to make sure of it. What happened in that conference room on the second floor of a law office on Marymount Avenue is a moment I will remember for the rest of my life, and not for the reason my nephew thought it would be memorable. Let me back up, because you need to understand the whole shape of this before I get you to that room. My mother was named Eleanor Renner. She was 89 years old when she died on a Thursday morning in early March, in her own bed, in the house on Kenilworth Road where I grew up. She'd lived in that house for 51 years. My father built the porch railing himself in 1974, and I used to run my hand along it as a kid, feeling every knot in the wood. My mother outlived my father by 19 years. She outlived my older brother, Robert, by 11. Robert died of a heart attack in a hotel room in Charlotte when he was 51, and his son, my nephew Preston, was 12 years old at the time. I want to be honest with you about something right here, because it matters for everything that comes after. I stepped in for that boy. Not because anyone forced me to, because somebody had to, and I loved my brother, and I loved his son. I coached Preston's Little League team on a field off Sweeten Creek Road for 4 straight seasons. I taught him to drive in an empty church parking lot on Charlotte Highway. I paid for a chunk of his tuition at Appalachian State without ever mentioning it to him, because that's not why you do it. I walked him down the aisle at his wedding 6 years ago, since his own father wasn't there to do it. I want you to hold on to that image, because you're going to need it later. My sister Carol is 64. She lives about 40 minutes away in Hendersonville, and she and my mother were close in a different way than my mother and I were. Carol handled the day-to-day errands, the pharmacy runs, that kind of thing, up until about 3 years ago, when her knees got bad enough that driving became difficult. That's when Preston, who by then was 29 and living 12 minutes from my mother's house, stepped in and asked for power of attorney. Everybody thought it made sense. He was young. He was local. He had the energy for it. I remember sitting at my mother's kitchen table the day she signed those papers, in October of 3 years back, and something in my gut didn't sit right. But I told myself I was just an old man who didn't like giving up control. I want to be clear about that, because people ask me later if I saw it coming from the start. I didn't. Not fully. I felt something. That's different from knowing something. For the first year, everything looked normal. Preston managed my mother's checking account, her Social Security deposits, the utilities on the Kenilworth Road house. He hired a woman named Rosa Delgado to come in as a home health aide 3 days a week, then 5 days a week once my mother's arthritis got bad enough that she needed help getting in and out of the bathtub. Rosa was 41 years old, originally from Hickory, a widow herself, with a teenage son named Mateo who wanted to study nursing. I met Rosa in the spring of that first year, when I stopped by on a Tuesday afternoon to fix a dripping faucet in my mother's kitchen, and I watched the two of them together for maybe 20 minutes before I said a word. My mother was laughing at something Rosa said about her son's driving. Real laughter, the kind you can't fake, the kind that comes easy. I want you to remember that laughter too, because it's going to matter. I visited my mother every single Sunday for those 3 years. Sometimes I brought her a sweet potato pie from a bakery on Charlotte Street that she liked. Sometimes I just sat with her on that porch my father built, and we talked about nothing in particular. And somewhere around the 18-month mark, I started noticing small things. My mother mentioned once, almost in passing, that Preston had asked her to sign some papers about the house, something about refinancing to cover her medical costs. She didn't remember the details. That worried me, but I told myself, again, that I was being an overprotective old man. Then in the fall of the second year, my mother mentioned that Preston had told her I was too busy with my own life to be bothered with her finances, and that it was better if I didn't get involved in that side of things. I remember exactly where I was standing when she said that. In her kitchen, holding a dish towel, staring at her. I didn't say anything to Preston about it. I want to be honest here too. I didn't want to start a war inside a family that had already buried enough people. So I did something quieter instead. I started keeping a small notebook. Dates, things my mother said, things that didn't add up. It sounds paranoid written out like that. It didn't feel paranoid at the time. It felt like something a careful man does when the ground under his feet starts to feel uneven. By the third year, my mother's memory had started slipping in ways that scared me. Not dementia exactly. Her doctor called it mild cognitive impairment, the kind where a person is sharp 1 hour and foggy the next. And that's exactly the kind of fog a man like Preston could work inside of if he wanted to. I didn't know yet how much he wanted to. I found out on a Sunday in January, 10 weeks before my mother died, and it came from a person nobody in my family thought to ask. Rosa Delgado pulled me aside in the driveway that day, after I'd said my goodbyes to my mother, and she looked over her shoulder twice before she spoke. "Mr. Renner," she said, "I don't know if this is my place, but I've been watching something for a while now, and I can't keep watching it without saying anything to somebody." I told her to say whatever she needed to say. She told me that over the past year, she'd seen Preston come by the house with folders, sit alone with my mother in the front room with the door mostly closed, and leave with signed papers. She told me that twice she'd seen new credit card offers arrive in the mail addressed to my mother, cards my mother had no memory of applying for. She told me that 6 months earlier, my mother had asked her, out of nowhere, whether Rosa thought it was normal for a son to be renaming his mother's bank accounts. Not a grandson. My mother had said son, and Rosa hadn't corrected her, because by then my mother sometimes mixed up Preston and Robert in her mind, and Rosa didn't think it was her place to untangle grief and memory in a woman's own kitchen. I stood in that driveway for a long time after Rosa said all that. I didn't know it yet, but that conversation was the beginning of the end of the version of my family I thought I had. I called an old friend of mine, Mike Sanderson, that same night. Mike spent 26 years with the Asheville Police Department, most of it in financial crimes, before he retired 4 years ago. We'd known each other since high school, played on the same softball team for a decade after that. I sat across from him at a diner off Tunnel Road, and I told him everything. The papers, the credit cards, Rosa's account, the notebook I'd been keeping. Mike listened without interrupting, the way he always does, and when I finished he set his coffee cup down and said, "Walt, you need a lawyer who isn't your family's lawyer, and you need a forensic accountant, and you need to do this quiet, because the second Preston knows you're looking, he's going to start covering his tracks faster than you can follow them." That's how I ended up in the office of a man named Harold Voss, an estate attorney with a practice on Broadway downtown, a man Mike vouched for personally. Harold was maybe 58, careful with his words, the kind of lawyer who writes things down while you're still talking instead of waiting for you to finish. I sat across from his desk in early February, and I said, "I think my nephew has been stealing from my mother, and I need you to help me find out for certain before it's too late to do anything about it." Harold didn't blink. He said, "Then let's find out." Within a week, Harold had brought in a forensic accountant, a sharp woman named Denise Okafor, who'd spent 15 years untangling exactly this kind of situation for elderly clients across the western part of the state. Denise requested 3 years of bank statements using a limited authorization Harold helped me draft, and what she found over the following 2 weeks made my stomach turn in a way I hadn't felt since the day we buried my brother. Preston had been moving money out of my mother's accounts for close to 2.5 years. Not in one dramatic theft, but slowly, the way water finds a crack in a foundation and just keeps widening it. Small transfers disguised as reimbursements for groceries and prescriptions. A new roof on my mother's house that was billed at $38,000 to a contractor that, when Denise looked closer, turned out to be a company registered to Preston's own address, one he'd quietly formed under the name Kenilworth Property Services. A reverse mortgage taken out on the Kenilworth Road house 18 months earlier, one my mother had signed in a moment of confusion Preston had almost certainly engineered, that had already paid out $210,000, nearly all of which had disappeared into an account with Preston's name on it. In total, Denise's report, dated the last week of February, put the number at just under $340,000. I sat in Harold's office reading that report, and I thought about every little league practice I drove that boy to. Every dollar of tuition I paid without telling a soul. I thought about walking him down the aisle at his wedding because his own father couldn't be there. And I thought, he did all of this while I was still driving out to Kenilworth Road every single Sunday with a sweet potato pie in my hand. There's more, Harold said, the way people say it right before the worst part. He slid a single sheet across the desk. It was a draft of a new will, dated just 8 months earlier, that Preston had apparently drawn up through a different attorney, one my mother had never met before that year. In it, the Kenilworth Road house and the bulk of my mother's remaining estate were left entirely to Preston, with a single token line leaving me, quote, my father's old tools, and nothing else. My sister Carol wasn't mentioned by name at all beyond a flat $5,000. Rosa Delgado wasn't mentioned in it whatsoever, despite 5 years of bathing my mother, dressing her, sitting up with her through 2 hospital stays, and telling her jokes about her son's terrible parallel parking until she laughed so hard she had to catch her breath. I asked Harold the only question that mattered to me right then. Did my mother know what he was doing to her? Harold looked at me for a long moment before he answered, and I didn't know it yet. But his answer was going to change everything I thought I understood about how this story was going to end. Welcome back to Sweet Family Revenge Stories. If you're just joining me here, grab whatever you're having, settle in, because this one's got a turn coming that I promise you did not see. If you've been with me a while, you already know the drill. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from tonight. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't yet, and let's get back into it, because we are just getting to the part that changes everything. Harold told me that, as far as he could determine from the paperwork Preston's second attorney had filed, my mother had signed that draft will on a day when her home health notes, which Denise had pulled as part of the financial record, described her as, quote, disoriented, repeating questions, unsure of the date. In other words, Preston had waited for a bad day. He had watched my mother's fog roll in, and he had walked through the open door it left behind. But here's the thing I didn't know yet, sitting in that office in late February. My mother wasn't as far gone as Preston believed. Not consistently. And 3 weeks before she died, on a clear-headed Tuesday afternoon in the first week of March, she had asked Rosa Delgado to drive her somewhere without telling Preston. I found this out from Rosa herself, 2 days after my mother's funeral, sitting on my own back porch with 2 cups of coffee going cold between us. Rosa told me that my mother had asked her, quiet and direct, to take her to see a lawyer, but not Preston's lawyer. My mother had remembered, in that clear window, the name of the attorney who had handled my father's estate decades earlier, a man who had since retired and handed his practice to his son. That son was Harold Voss. My mother had sat in Harold's office on the 6th of March, for days before she died, without me knowing a single thing about it. Harold told me later that she was sharp that day, sharper than he expected given what he already knew about her condition from the records Denise had gathered. She told him she believed her grandson had been taking money from her, and that she wanted to fix her will before, in her words, quote, it's too late to matter. Harold, already deep into the investigation I'd hired him for, without violating a single confidence, helped her draft a new document. A final one, witnessed properly, notarized properly, with a capacity evaluation from her own physician attached the same day, specifically so it could never be challenged later on the grounds that she wasn't of sound mind. My mother, it turned out, had been 3 steps ahead of all of us the entire time, working in the small, clear windows her illness still allowed her, determined that the truth would outlast her even if her memory couldn't. She died 4 days later, in her sleep, with Rosa in the next room. I got the call at 6:40 in the morning, and I drove to Kenilworth Road so fast, I don't remember most of the drive. I remember standing in that front room, the one my father built the porch outside of, and thinking that whatever else had happened, whatever Preston had done, my mother had gone out on her own terms, in the house she loved, with someone who genuinely cared for her close by. That was the one mercy in all of it. The funeral was on a Saturday in the middle of March, at a small stone church off Charlotte Street that my parents had attended for 40 years. Preston stood up and gave a eulogy about how devoted he'd been to his grandmother in her final years, how he'd, quote, dropped everything to take care of her when it mattered most. I sat in the third pew, and I did not say a word. I want you to understand why. Harold had asked me, and Denise had asked me, and even Mike had asked me, to hold everything until the will reading. Every account frozen, every document filed, everything airtight and ready, and not one syllable revealed before then. Because a half-exposed fraud is just an accusation. A fully documented one, laid out all at once, in front of witnesses, is something nobody can talk their way around. So I stood at that funeral, shook Preston's hand, let him hug me, and I said nothing. I didn't know it yet, standing there, but the hardest 4 weeks of my life were about to be the calmest 4 weeks of my life. Because for the first time in years, I finally had certainty instead of suspicion. The will reading was scheduled for the second Tuesday in April, at 10 in the morning, in a conference room on the second floor of Harold's office building on Broadway. Preston had assumed, reasonably enough given what he knew, that his own attorney's version of the will was the one that would be read. He didn't know Harold existed in this story at all. He didn't know about Denise's report. He didn't know his grandmother had spent an hour in a clear-headed window signing away every plan he'd spent 2.5 years building. I arrived 10 minutes early, in a gray sport coat I'd worn to my brother's funeral 11 years earlier, and I sat down at the far end of the long table. Carol arrived next, in a black dress, looking tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. She squeezed my shoulder as she passed, and said, "This is going to be hard, Walt." And I remember thinking, you have no idea. Preston arrived last, the way he always seemed to arrive last to everything, wearing a blazer that looked new, with his wife Brooke on his arm. He shook my hand, told me it was good to see family, and sat down directly across from me with the easy posture of a man who believes he has already won. There were 7 of us in that room. Me, Carol, Preston, Brooke, 2 cousins on my mother's side who'd driven up from Greenville, and Harold at the head of the table with a leather folder in front of him. Rosa Delgado was not in the room. I want to explain that, because it matters for what happens later. Harold had told her, gently, the week before, that she was welcome to attend if she wished, but that some of what would be discussed might be difficult to hear in front of a room full of strangers, and Rosa, being Rosa, said she'd rather hear it from me afterward over a cup of coffee than sit through it in a lawyer's office. I respected that. I still do. Harold opened the folder and began reading through the preliminary language, the standard opening paragraphs you'd expect. Preston sat back in his chair, relaxed, one arm draped over the back of Brooke's chair, and when Harold reached the part about the residence on Kenilworth Road, Preston actually smiled. It was a small smile, the kind a man gives when he already knows what's coming and just wants to enjoy watching everyone else find out. Then Harold paused and said something that made the whole room shift. He said, "Before I continue, I need to note for the record that the document I am about to read supersedes an earlier draft dated approximately 8 months prior. This is the final and legally operative will of Eleanor Renner, executed on March 6th of this year, for days before her passing." I watched Preston's face change in real time. Not dramatically, just a small tightening around the eyes, the look of a man recalculating. Harold continued reading. My mother had left her modest remaining savings, roughly $40,000 that hadn't yet been touched, split evenly between Carol and the 2 cousins from Greenville, with a personal note to each of them that Harold read aloud. Small memories, small kindnesses, the kind of thing only a mother notices about her children over 60 years. Then Harold reached the section concerning the Kenilworth Road house, and I watched Preston lean forward. That's when Preston interrupted. He said, "This can't be right. There's a mistake. My grandmother and I had already worked out the arrangement for the house months ago. I have documentation." Harold, without raising his voice at all, said, "Mr. Sutter, I'm aware of the document you're referring to. I helped draft the one that replaces it. I'd ask you to let me finish before you respond." Preston sat back, jaw tight, and that's when he turned to me. He said it loud enough for the whole table to hear. He said, "Of course you're behind this somehow. You've been circling around for years, waiting for your moment, and now here it is, the old fool still living in the past, still trying to insert yourself where you're not needed. I want you to understand something about that moment. Nobody in that room defended me. Not one person." Carol looked down at her hands. The cousins from Greenville, who barely knew either of us, actually laughed, a nervous, uncomfortable laugh, the kind that happens when people don't know what else to do with tension in a room. Brooke smiled at her husband like he'd just made a clever point at a dinner party. I sat there, hands folded, and I said absolutely nothing. I wasn't hurt by the silence. I want to be honest about that. I'd expected it. What I felt instead was something closer to patience, the specific patience of a man who has already read the last page of the book everyone else is still starting. Harold let the moment settle, then said, "Mr. Sutter, I'd ask you to sit down and remain quiet, because there is more in this document, and you are going to want to hear all of it before you say another word in this room." Preston sat down, but his hands were shaking slightly on the table, and I don't think anyone in that room but me noticed it, because I was the only one still watching him instead of watching Harold. Harold turned the page, and this is where everything changed. The Kenilworth Road house, my mother's will stated, was to be placed into an irrevocable trust, with instructions that it be sold within 12 months, and the full proceeds, along with the remaining value recovered from the reverse mortgage litigation already in progress, divided in a specific and deliberate way. 60% to a newly established scholarship and care fund in my mother's name, to be administered through Harold's office, with the explicit first beneficiary named as Mateo Delgado, Rosa's son, to fund his nursing education in full, with any remaining balance to support other home health workers caring for elderly clients in Buncombe County who could not otherwise afford further education. 25% directly to Rosa Delgado herself. Quote, "For 5 years of a devotion my own family could not always manage to give me." End quote, Harold read, and his voice caught slightly on that line, which told me he hadn't fully steadied himself from reading it the first time either. The remaining 15% to me, Walter Renner, quote, "Not because I believe money can repay a Sunday visit, but because he never once asked for anything, and a mother notices that," end quote. And then Harold turned to the final page, the one my mother had specifically asked him, in that clear-headed hour on the 6th of March, to read last, out loud, in front of everyone, no matter who was in the room. It contained no inheritance at all. It named Preston Sutter directly. My mother had written, in her own words that Harold read verbatim, that she had discovered, in the final months of her life, the extent to which her grandson had used her confusion and her trust against her, that she had reviewed documentation gathered on her behalf, that she forgave him as a grandmother, but that forgiveness and inheritance were not the same thing, and that she was formally disinheriting him from any portion of her estate, effective immediately, with the specific direction that this letter, and the financial findings attached to it, be forwarded to the Buncombe County District Attorney's Office for review, because, in her words, quote, "A woman is not required to protect a thief simply because she loves him," end quote. The room went completely silent. I mean completely. I could hear the air conditioning cycling on somewhere above us. Preston's face had gone the color of old paper. He said, "This is insane." She didn't know what she was signing. She was confused. Everyone in this room knows she'd been confused for months. And Harold, calm as a man reading a grocery list, reached into his folder and slid a second document across the table. A capacity evaluation, signed and dated the same day as the will, by my mother's own longtime physician, stating clearly that she was lucid, oriented to person, place, and time, and fully capable of understanding the document she was executing. Beside it, Harold placed Denise Okafor's forensic report, the full $340,000 laid out in black and white, transfer by transfer, invoice by invoice, the shell company with Preston's own home address on the registration documents. I finally spoke for the first time since walking into that room. I said, "Preston, you called me an old fool for living in the past 20 minutes ago. I want you to know I wasn't living in the past. I was building a case. There's a difference." Nobody laughed this time. Brooke stood up so fast her chair nearly tipped over. She said, "I had no idea. I swear to God I had no idea about any of this." And I believed her, honestly, because I'd watched her face during Harold's reading and it had cracked open the same way everyone else's had. Preston didn't stand. He sat there staring at the forensic report like it might rearrange itself if he looked hard enough, the same way I imagine every man does in the exact moment he understands there is no version of the next sentence that helps him. Carol finally spoke, and her voice was shaking. She said, "Walt, why didn't you tell me any of this?" And I said, "Because I needed it to be true before I needed it to be believed. If I'd come to you with suspicion 4 weeks ago, it would have torn this family in half over nothing but my word against his. I needed proof, not accusations. I needed your mother's own hand on the final page, not mine." Harold closed his folder and said the last formal thing he had to say that morning. The documentation compiled during this investigation has already been forwarded, per Mrs. Renner's written instruction, to both the district attorney's office and to the state bar's ethics division. Given that the attorney who drafted the prior will did so without properly verifying the client's cognitive state at the time of signing, which is itself a serious concern. Mr. Sutter, you should expect to hear from investigators within the week. Preston stood up then, finally, and for a second I thought he might say something to me. Some last attempt at the same performance he'd been running for 2.5 years. He didn't. He just looked at me, and something in his face, for one honest second, looked like the 12-year-old boy I used to drive to Little League practice, scared and cornered and out of moves. Then he turned and walked out of that room without another word. Brooke half a step behind him, and the door clicked shut so quietly it somehow felt louder than if he'd slammed it. I drove straight from that conference room to Rosa Delgado's house, a small brick duplex off Riverside Drive, and I sat with her at her kitchen table and told her everything. Every line of that will, word for word, the way Harold had read it. When I got to the part about Mateo's nursing education being fully funded, Rosa put both hands over her mouth and didn't say anything for almost a full minute. Then she said, "She never once made me feel like the help, Walt. Not one day in 5 years. I always felt like family in that house, even when I wasn't sure I should." I told her, "You were more family to her these last 5 years than most of the people who shared her blood. She earned this the way you earn anything real." Slowly, and without ever once asking for credit for it. Mateo, who I met properly for the first time that same afternoon, was 19 years old, quiet, polite, already halfway through his first year at a community college in Asheville working toward his prerequisites. When his mother told him what the trust meant for his tuition, he didn't say much either. He just hugged her for a long time in that small kitchen, and I stood by the door and let them have the moment, because some things aren't meant to have witnesses standing too close. The house on Kenilworth Road sold in the last week of June, 41 days on the market, for $412,000, to a young family with 2 kids and a dog, and I stood on that porch my father built one final time before the closing, running my hand along the railing the way I used to as a boy. I thought about my mother sitting in Harold's office on a clear Tuesday afternoon, for days before she died, fighting through whatever fog she was living inside of to make one thing certain before she left this world. I thought, she never stopped being sharp. She just stopped having the strength to prove it every single day. And in the 1 hour she had left where the strength came back, she used every ounce of it to make sure the truth outlived her. The investigation into Preston moved slower than any of us expected, the way these things do. By late summer, the district attorney's office had filed formal charges, exploitation of a vulnerable adult and financial fraud, both felonies under state law given the amount involved. Preston hired a defense attorney, tried to argue that his grandmother had willingly given him access to her accounts, but Denise's timeline, cross-referenced against the medical records showing exactly when my mother's confused episodes occurred, made that defense fall apart fairly quickly. Preston reached a plea agreement in the fall, avoiding the maximum sentence in exchange for full restitution and 5 years of probation, along with a felony record that will follow him for the rest of his life. He lost his job at a property management firm downtown within a month of the charges becoming public. Brooke filed for divorce in October. I heard about both of those things secondhand, the way you hear about a house down the street burning, close enough to feel it, far enough that it isn't yours to grieve. I want to be honest with you about something, because people ask me this more than anything else. Do I feel bad for him? And the answer is complicated in a way that surprises even me. I don't feel triumphant. I never wanted to stand in a room and watch a boy I raised for 4 Little League seasons and 1 wedding walk out of a lawyer's office with his whole future collapsing behind him. But I also think about my mother, sitting alone in that front room some mornings, confused about what year it was, signing papers she couldn't fully understand, while the person she trusted most watched the fog roll in and used it. I think about the difference between the two of us in that final year. I showed up every single Sunday whether or not there was anything in it for me. He showed up when there was. Carol and I talk every week now, more than we ever did before all this. She apologized to me on the phone about 2 weeks after the will reading, her voice breaking in a way I hadn't heard from my sister since we were kids. She said, "I laughed in that room, Walt. I actually laughed when he called you a fool, and I have thought about that every single day since." I told her, "You were grieving and confused, and he was loud and confident. And that's exactly the combination people like Preston count on. Don't spend the rest of your life punishing yourself for one bad minute in a room he'd been setting up for months. She still brings it up sometimes, though, usually late at night on the phone, and I let her, because some apologies need saying more than once before they settle. Rosa still calls me every couple of weeks, usually to tell me something about Mateo, a grade he got, a clinical rotation he's excited about, small ordinary updates that mean more to me than almost anything else in my life right now. 2 weeks ago, she called just to tell me that Mateo had passed his first nursing exam with a 94, and that he'd called her crying with relief the second the results posted, and that the first thing he said to her was, "Mom, I get to actually do this because of what Mrs. Renner did." I sat on my back porch after that call for a long time, looking at the mountains, thinking about my mother's laughter drifting out of that kitchen on Kenilworth Road 3 years ago, the day I first met Rosa, and watched the two of them together, and thought, this is a good woman, without knowing yet how much that would come to matter. I still visit my mother's grave every other Sunday, out at a cemetery off Riceville Road, and I bring the same sweet potato pie from the bakery on Charlotte Street, and I sit for a while, and I tell her things. Mostly I tell her that it worked. That the hours she spent in Harold's office, fighting through whatever fog she was carrying, built something that outlasted every lie Preston tried to bury it under. I tell her that Mateo Delgado is going to be a nurse because of her, that somewhere down the line he's going to sit with some other confused, frightened elderly person in the middle of the night and know exactly how to be gentle with them. And that gentleness traces itself all the way back to a woman who never stopped fighting for what was right, even when her own memory was failing her one day at a time. Preston called me once, back in November, a single time, and I almost didn't pick up. I did in the end. He didn't apologize, not really, not in the way I think he wanted to believe he did. He said he was sorry things had gotten so complicated, that he never meant for any of it to go this far, that he'd just been under a lot of pressure with his own bills, and had made some choices he regretted. I let him finish. Then I said, "Preston, I'm not angry at you for needing help. I'd have given you help if you'd asked me, same as I always did. I'm not even angry at you for making mistakes, because we all make those. What I can't get past is that you watched your own grandmother lose pieces of herself, day by day, and instead of protecting her, you used it. That's not pressure, son. That's a choice. And you're going to have the rest of your life to sit with which one you made." He didn't have anything to say back to that. We haven't spoken since. I think about the phrase he used that day in the conference room more than I probably should. Old fool living in the past. There's something almost funny about it now, looking back, because in a way he wasn't entirely wrong about the living in the past part. I was living in the past. I was living in every Sunday I ever spent on that porch, every practice I drove him to, every dollar of tuition I quietly paid, every ounce of trust my mother placed in me over 67 years of being her son. I was living in the version of this family I actually believed in. The difference is, I wasn't foolish about it. I was patient. And patience, it turns out, when it's paired with a good lawyer, a careful accountant, and one woman's determination to tell the truth in the last clear hours she had left on this earth, is not the same thing as weakness at all. Some nights I sit out on that porch of my own house off Kimberly Avenue, and I think about the moment the lawyer opened that final envelope, my mother's own words carrying across a silent room, landing exactly where she meant them to land. I think about how she must have felt, sitting in Harold's office on the 6th of March, racing against a fog she knew was closing back in, determined that her last clear thoughts would matter more than anyone's confident lies. She didn't get to see that room in April. She didn't get to see Preston's face go the color of old paper, or Rose's hands over her mouth, or Mateo hugging his mother in that small kitchen off Riverside Drive. But she knew. Somehow, in that last hour, writing every line by hand, she knew exactly what she was setting in motion, and she trusted it would land where it needed to, even if she wasn't there to watch it happen. That's the thing I hold on to now, more than the money, more than the vindication, more than the look on my nephew's face. My mother spent her final clear hour thinking not about herself, but about who deserved to be protected and who deserved to be told the truth. She did that for Rosa. She did that for Mateo. And in her own quiet way, without ever once raising her voice, she did that for me too. Some inheritances aren't about what you receive. They're about what somebody trusted you enough to finish on their behalf. I finished it. and I sleep just fine at night knowing that. If you made it this far with me tonight, I'd love to hear where you're watching from, so drop that in the comments below. If this story meant something to you, hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that patience and proof will always outlast a loud voice in a small room. I'll see you in the next one.